Okay, now we're on. Okay, I just hit the wrong thing. I was trying to get the, there, I've got it. I wanted to get the closed captioning. So, all right. Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Planetary Pause series. Today we are honored to have Michael Nagler and Stephanie Van Hook from the Meta Center in Petaluma as our guests. Michael Nagler is the president and founder of the Meta Center for Nonviolence in Petaluma, and he is one of the most respected advocates for nonviolence worldwide. He founded the Peace and Conflict Studies program at UC Berkeley, where he is a professor emeritus of classics and comparative literature. He is the author of several books, including The Nonviolence Handbook, The Third Harmony, and The Search for a Nonviolent Future. He is also director of the documentary film, The Third Harmony, Nonviolence and the New Story of Human Nature. We will show a 3-minute trailer of this film just before the Q&A section today. And Stephanie Van Hook is the executive director of the Meta Center for Nonviolence and is the co-creator of the board game, Cosmic Peace Force Mission, Harmony 3. It sounds like an answer to Star Wars. The Meta Center offers certificates in nonviolence studies, nonviolence retreats, and a nonviolence crash course for teachers and other relevant programs for fostering peaceful and respectful relationships. So welcome, Michael and Stephanie. Happy to have you here.
Nice to be here.
So I want to start with something in your book, The Search for a Nonviolent Future, which I've reread recently, and I am just blown away by it. And I want to recommend it to everybody who's on this call. If you haven't read it, it is really an important part of peace education, a pivotal part, I believe. And you talk about one thing at the beginning of the book that I think is so important to get right, and that is the wrong questions. You mentioned that the wrong questions are often asked by the media or even the victims of violence and people whose opinions are not really informed by critical thinking. So give us some examples of what these wrong questions are.
Yeah, very good. Mostly it has to do with two things. One is trivialization, where they immediately go to the details. Was it a ghost handgun or a registered handgun? Where did the person get it? You know, and things that would never, here's my real complaint, they will never lead you to the real question, which is, why is violence increasing and what can we do about it? So that's, I think, actually the major mistake that's done by the media. As I so often say, they're practicing education without a license. And the other mistake, of course, which we're more familiar with, is sensationalism. And the enormous bias. This is also treated in the next book, the more recent one, called The Third Harmony, and in that film that goes along with, we have a citation, an interview with Frans de Waal, a famous animal behaviorist, who talks about the fact, well, he says we've been telling ourselves the wrong story about human nature for centuries, and he also talks about the bias toward excitement, which unfortunately, it seems to me, unfortunately doesn't begin to say it. Tragically, it makes violence something very attractive and exciting for people to read about and think about and hear about, and you know perfectly well what they're going to do. If they read about it, think about it, and hear about it, eventually, at least some of them are going to do it. So it's a real compromise of, or downgrading, degradation, I have to say, of human nature.
Mm-hmm. You know, along with that, even though it was a question I wanted to ask later, but I think it dovetails with this one nicely, is the book by Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman, right, on killing, which he talks about how video games prepare soldiers to really become desensitized to killing. And I'd like you to comment on that if you can.
Well, in that book, or I think it was actually maybe the next one, called let's stop teaching our kids to kill, he points out that the very same video games that you can just get off the shelf in a store are shown to the military to, as you rather gently put it, Georgia, to desensitize them. You might almost, if you wanted to be really, no, I won't say it. Okay, to desensitize them. And that these very same videos are being watched by our children. So what do we expect the result is going to be?
Mhm.
That was really a devastating revelation to me because I was too old to play video games. So I knew they were all horrendously violent.
Right.
My brother and I tried to write one that wasn't violent, but I don't know, Stephanie, maybe we should take that on.
Yeah. That's
But a lot of people have said that to us. But as we, part of the board game was definitely to get people sitting in a room together and away from screens. So it's a bigger topic.
right. It is. Another area that you talked about in your book that's always interested me too is the untold story of peace. And many nations have lived in peace for years, sometimes even hundreds of years, but we don't learn anything about them in our history books. I know there's a necessity to be accountable for our violent history, which is very current right now with our history in this country, and it's important that we are accountable. But at the same time, there is no opposite push to reveal the history of peace. And I first became aware of this when I was doing, looking into the history of the city-state of Dubrovnik, which had existed for nearly 1,000 years without any war or any warfare. And you think, well, how did they do this? And why didn't we learn about it? And we learned nothing about it. So I'd like you to talk about something you said in the book, which was, quote, "You just don't see what's coming at you from another paradigm." So, which I thought was very appropriate because the peaceful paradigm doesn't seem to be seen from people in this paradigm. And I'd like you to comment on that.
Right. It wouldn't be too different from what I said before. And Franz Duval speaks to this very well in the documentary that unfortunately we have a natural tendency, which has an obvious function, for us to pay attention to threat, pay attention to danger. But the media latches on because we live in what's been called an attention economy. You can't sell anything, do anything, influence anybody unless you can grab their attention. So unfortunately, our culture, as you know, not just the electronic media, but everything that we're taught, even in schools, is capitalizing, I guess I would say, on that cheap and easy way to get our attention. And of course, this is a tremendously self-fulfilling prophecy because after a while, we internalize their definition of an event. You know, an event is when something goes wrong. So as Gandhi said quite a while ago, that is 1909, two brothers live in peace for 50 years and nobody pays attention. One day they have a fight and it's all over the village. So
Yes, that's the point. It's just not it's not seen. The piece is not acknowledged. There are two things I want to probably wrap this into one question, but they're two different ideas in a sense. Because you mentioned the underlying cause of violence you describe as hatred, and that violence is violence irrespective of the motivation, which I think is really important to understand. Nothing really justifies it. And along with that, people think of nonviolence as a protest movement. And you talk about its real power as one to create and reconstruct. So I'd like you to kind of talk about what does the creating and reconstructing of a nonviolent culture look like?
yeah, I have found, and Stephanie, don't hesitate, weigh in at any time.
Okay.
But I have found that one of the most overlooked aspects of Gandhi's career and what he did was what he called constructive program. And in the end of that started when he was in South Africa.
Mhm.
1894. He's telling his fellow Indians in South Africa, well, we do have some problems. Let's strengthen up our own community before we tell other communities to respect us and get off our back. And by the end of his life, constructive program was really much more important to him than protest and disruption and what I call obstructive program. So if you look at our roadmap, which is on our website, it's built on 3 concentric circles where you begin at the center with your own personal cultivation. And we have 5 steps that we talk about there. First one being no surprise. Watch out for the mass media. Don't let that be the shapers of your consciousness, and so on. And then when you feel ready to act, the first thing you should do is to think about, how can I construct the answer to this problem myself? Like, okay, he wants to boycott foreign cloth. Excellent. But what he really insists on before he even really launches that is reviving homespun cloth. Make yourself independent and then kick it off. So there's many, many reasons why a constructive program is actually preferable to protest, and why we think it's very helpful to follow this centripetal trajectory of personal cultivation, constructive program, and resistance. If for one thing, you'll find resistance much easier if you're starting from a position of strength and where you've taken care of yourself.
And that's where meditation comes in too.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. So say a bit about that, how that supports strengthening in that area.
Yeah, well, I mean, the minute we recognize that violence ultimately springs from within us, that we could be dealing with the most challenging situation in the world without violence, if we didn't have that inner capacity, then it becomes obvious that you want to work on, and this is where the miracle of meditation, which I just can never get over the first time I heard it, was that you don't have to certainly not deny your aggressive negative impulses. You don't have to ignore them, block them. What you do is you take constructive action, and the same energy that was feeding the anger and the feeling of alienation towards others and the hatred gets, so to speak, siphoned off into positive channels. And so I know in our meditation practice, the kind that Stephanie and I have been following for a long time, what you're doing is constantly kind of channeling and redirecting, harnessing, if you will, internal energies. I mean, that doesn't describe how we go about it, but that is the purpose of it. And I know that Thich Nhat Hanh said, God bless him, he said, well, you may believe in nonviolence and talk about nonviolence, but when you're standing there and the police are coming down the street at you with their snarling dogs and all of that, your nonviolence will go out the window unless you have stabilized it with some inner practice. And he actually cites meditation.
And you're actually talking about kind of a control of your emotional urgent impulses.
And you can't expect to do it when you're in a critical situation where your life is threatened, you're angry as heck. So you practice doing it over and over again. One of the most interesting scientific experiments for me is done way back in 1952 where they took two classrooms full of children and gave one group, the same kids basically. They gave one group um, empathy training or conflict training. I don't know what stage of development it was back then, but they gave them some, and the other group they didn't. So it was your classic double blind, right? And then they took both kids, put them together in the auditorium, the school auditorium, and turned off the lights and said, "Now you're going to see a very good movie." And they also handed them a chocolate bar as they went in. I don't think you'd be able to do this today, by the way. It was an extremely unkind experiment, but they did it. So let's reap the benefit. And then they snapped the lights on and they said, "No movie, give us back the chocolate bars." And then they sent the poor kids back to their classrooms and watched them, as scientists will, through their one-way glass. Now they wanted to see, the hypothesis they had posed, or the question was, how long would it take the kids who'd been trained to, be cooperative and empathic, how long would it take that to break down under this horrendous frustration? And to their utter amazement, they found that, while the normal kids who hadn't had any such training, you could hardly control them. You couldn't teach in that classroom. The kids who had been trained were more cooperative than ever. So it's like that channel that they had laid in their mental architecture, the energy fed into that channel instead of going the other way, the impulsive way. So it was an astounding study. And I think nobody really understood the significance of it because of, what we've just been talking about.
Right. And now I have two different questions that, again, I'm going to kind of put together because I think I know partially the answer to one of them, but I want you to articulate it. Because one of the problems that I've had in the past, and I know other people have had with the theories of nonviolence, are the point where the sacrifice comes in. Are you willing to die for a cause? At some point, it sounds like martyrdom, masochism even, and that's hard to identify with. So I look at that, and it's been my struggle with nonviolence all my life, I have to say, that there's a point at which, no, I'm not willing to die for a cause. Mm-hmm. And that's my reality. So then I look at what you've put together that answers that for me, which is the escalation of conflict curve. Because if I can engage in that stage before it requires that kind of violent, what I call masochistic martyrdom, then we don't ever get to that point. We don't ever get to the point of that being needed. So I want you to talk about this escalation of conflict curve, because I think this would really make nonviolence much more appealing.
Yeah, much more practical for the
right.
average person. Yeah, and I make that point when I talk about the escalation curve, that it's divided into three phases as conflict goes from mild, moderate to severe. The first phase is where you can do negotiation. So that's where techniques like nonviolent communication are extremely helpful. The second phase, you have to do satyagraha. You have to be ready to do resistance. The third stage, if it happens, if your issue is something that you must stop, you cannot live with it, then you should realize that you have the last card that you can play, which is the willingness to lay down your life. And I'm placing emphasis on that. What makes it happen is not dying. It's too late then. What makes it happen is the willingness to die, which should be extremely rare. And I think the people who jump into it at a much earlier stage of conflict, there, I think they are really risking a martyrdom complex and masochism. But I'll add one thing to that, and that is that because nonviolence arises in the depths of our being, our inherited capacities, because it's that deep, you can't always tell from a person's behavior what is motivating. So you could have two people side by side, both decided they're going to fast unto death if this thing isn't fixed. And one of them will be doing it, with pride and a deep sense of anguish that I can't live with this. And that person will be, loving life and be doing this for a very, very honest reason. And the other person would be a show off. And, that's a danger that we run. I mean, I remember in the free speech movement, we were striking our classes and doing all of this to get the ability to have political speech on the Berkeley campus. And suddenly, about the third day of the strike, when things were really going strong, a young guy comes running in off Bancroft Avenue with a newspaper. He says, "Look at this." And the headline, that newspaper is now defunct, by the way, but the headline was, "Rebels yell no," and it's all about us. And so from that point forward, I watched people being drawn into the lure of excitement and attention, and drawn correspondingly away from the cause, which, more often than not, a nonviolent effort will be boring as hell. You'll be slogging along with no apparent results, but that could be exactly the right thing in terms of the curve.
Yeah, I think that curve is so important to understand and engage early.
Yeah.
And
that's motivation for us to engage early.
Exactly.
Recognize how it's going to get harder and harder the more we delay. Your options will shrink and shrink and shrink till they come down to something that you really don't like
and don't want to do. So, and then I'm going to do, I'm going to ask you some things about what you're doing now, but there was just one last thing before we get to that. Because you mentioned working on shared problems as a way to come together of groups who differ. And I think this is a really important idea. And I certainly saw that or read about it. I didn't see it actually. Because in Yugoslavia under Tito, after they broke from the USSR, he created this youth program in the summer where the different youth from Croatia, from Slovenia, Bosnia, Serbia, Kosovo, they all came together and worked on these projects that modernized their country. And they developed a sense of honor, of pride, of being part of bringing their country into the modern era. And they worked together and saw themselves not as Serbs, Croats, and Bosnians, but as Yugoslavs. It had a tremendous impact on that generation. And so I just wanted you to say something about this working together on a shared problem or project.
Yes, the classic experiment here takes place in a children's camp in Canada, where the counselors deliberately, once again, science is tough, folks. Once again, they deliberately created artificial dissension between two groups. Stephanie, what was the name of that couple that wrote that book, In Common Predicament?
It'll come back to me.
Sharif and
Sharif. Yeah.
Sharif and Sharif. That's how I get all my questions answered. I ask Stephanie and then the answer goes to me. So, or else it doesn't. So anyway, it did not take much to introduce a severely competitive spirit between these two groups, the rattlesnakes and the eagles. And then they systematically tried various things to overcome what they had created, which was a sense of competition, hostility, dislike. And they tried all the things that you think would work, like common entertainment. That had very little effect. Common meals had a little effect. But then one day, I think the truck broke down and they needed to go into town for something. And so, kids from both groups, without paying attention to that designation, got involved in fixing the truck. And it had a tremendous effect on resolving the conflict. So then they tried more, like, artificially pulling off the distributor wires on the truck and saying, oh God, now what do we do? And things like that. And yeah, the book is called In Common Predicament.
Okay.
And again, it's a classic study, which again has, I think, far from the kind of attention that it deserves.
And that can be put in the chat box, John. I'm sure you can find it.
Yeah,
Um,
Sharif, Sharif and Sharif.
So now I want to ask you what you're doing now and what the future is, some peace training at the Meta Center, what that's about. What are you working on now? Your plans for the future?
Right. Delighted to talk about that. But Stephanie, I think you've got this stuff more.
Well, I'd like to.
Stephanie,
I'd like to.
Stephanie, can you put down your volume? It's very, very loud.
Okay.
Do you know how to do that?
Yeah. How's that?
Go down to the microphone and see that arrow by the microphone on the bottom there.
Yeah.
And where it says audio settings, click on that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you will see up above where it says output volume. It must be way up.
No, it's not, but I will put it lower.
Oh, you actually want to mess with input volume. Output is how she hears us.
Okay.
Input is how we hear her.
Tell her, John, what she needs to do.
So, I mean, you can just uncheck mark on the microphone section, there's a little automatically adjust microphone volume box. Yeah. You can just uncheck that and then scroll the bar like halfway down, and then you should be fine.
Okay, how's that?
Better, sufficient. I mean,
yes, great. Okay, great. Go ahead, Stephanie. Sorry.
Sure. So, I think in order to answer that very direct question about what Meta's up to, I'm gonna go about it in a roundabout way, based on some of the questions that were already asked, and it involved Michael in it too, and you, Georgia. But your very first question was about we're asking the wrong questions. And that's one of my favorite parts about the Search for Nonviolent Future, which happened to be the book that I read that ended up leading me to find Michael, locate him in an organization that we are both part of called the Peace and Justice Studies Association, and trap him at a conference and say, I want to learn how to meditate. I want to learn more about your approach to nonviolence. So it's one of the foundational questions for me, although not the foundational question for me in nonviolence. And I think that not just, asking the questions about, what kind of gun did the shooter use, or, how many people were killed, but asking questions like the wrong questions that we ask that don't get us down the road of nonviolence are questions like, well, if nonviolence works, then what would you do if your grandmother was raped in front of your eyes? If nonviolence works, then what about Hitler? That didn't seem to work there. Without knowing anything about the fact that nonviolence was actually tried, and when it was tried, it was successful. And otherwise that there wasn't a massive nonviolent resistance movement. So that's the wrong question, right? We ask the wrong questions about nonviolence because we don't have the awareness as a society, as a global culture, that nonviolence is our birthright. To get along peacefully with our species and with the rest of life is our birthright, and we should have skills in doing that, and not be used as pawns for global capitalism where conflict fuels nuclear war nuclear weapon sales, conflict fuels insecurity that bloats our Pentagon's budget. We're being used, we're being manipulated. So there's some things to work out there. I just want to throw that out there to you all first to see if you want to expand on that.
Well, I think that's a very important piece, because every single day the media is asking the wrong questions when there's a violent event. Every single day, every single case, they never ask the systemic questions of why is this happening. They don't ask that. They, like Michael said, they ask, well, what kind of gun did they use? They ask these questions about details that, or what was the kid's life like? They don't really ask what's happening in our culture. What is supporting this type of runaway violence, which we have and they don't have in Europe. So, but that question isn't asked. And I think the more we deal with that, I think the better educated people will get around dealing with, we've got to turn off our TVs is what tends to happen.
Yeah, or like homelessness, like we're taught that homelessness is just an unsolvable problem, and maybe we can do some things, but there's really no reason to think that we can actually solve the problem of homelessness by finding homes for people or changing our economic system where housing is a human right.
Exactly. There are places where that is true and where there isn't poverty. And, I've been to some of those places, and probably you have too, in Scandinavia, in the Mondragon Basque region. It's astonishing to go to a place where you see no poverty, no slums, no one in the streets. Everyone is at a certain level of comfort in the society. And so, if it can happen in a few places, it could happen everywhere. I think, that's one of the things you're teaching as well. So you mentioned the last thing I will do before we go to this little trailer for your film is nonviolence as a daily practice. What does that look like? What does it require?
Yeah, I think that's also, it's part of what kind of questions should we be asking about nonviolence? That again, once we have a broader view of it, that it's not just a way of protesting one off when we finally get to the point of saying things are wrong. But you had also brought up that the root of violence, that you mentioned that Michael had said in one of his books, that the root of violence is hatred. But we go much further with that, with what's happening right now in our programs. The root of violence, we say, is not hatred, because we can go deeper than that. It's this sense that you and I are separate, and that we're separate from the rest of life. And so that's a kind of fundamental violence that's taken place in the human image, in the human psyche, that there are alternative cosmologies around us where that is not the story, and we have to bring those alive and live them out. But nonviolence is that alternative cosmology of saying, as long as I'm acting out of a paradigm of separateness, I'm going to cause violence to myself, to others, and I can't help it. I'm going to think it's the most natural thing for me to do. So if I can get into that space and make that switch and begin to experiment and test, what would it look like if I believed that if I do something to mess this interview up for Georgia, that it won't affect, my well-being? What if I hurt her feelings? How will that, that we're not separate, and start expanding that in larger ways, paying attention. And that's what nonviolence as a daily practice does for us. It encourages us to try out small experiments in our own lives with others, telling ourselves the new story when something does work out, when, all of a sudden we realize, hey, I've been meditating every day and I've been telling my mind that I am not my thoughts. And then the other day, this person who's been picking on me for my entire life, I was able to tell them with kindness, that's not who I am. To be able to see a relationship between the inner and the outer, it's just incredible. And it also, again, that's the key to building a nonviolent society, is saying that we're not just using nonviolence like the new product that we're going to get off the shelf, and then it doesn't work well because it's too late. but rather it's the very foundation of the way that we behave and engage. And we're going to make mistakes.
Of course.
We're gonna fail, and we have to take a new approach to failure, too.
And that's part of the new paradigm too.
Yeah.
So now do you want to share the screen to show this 3-minute trailer for the film, and then we'll go to questions and answers. Is that your computer, Michael, or Stephanie's?
Ooh, I will bring it up.
Are we going to share that trailer?
Oh yeah, that will be my screen, and let me just
Okay.
get that ready for you.
All right, I've got it so that you can share it.
Okay. Let's see how this is going to work.
Are you ready to do that?
Sharing.
There we go.
And
Great.
now what I'd like to do, I'm at the website thirdharmony.org, so everybody, if you want to go to it later. Can you see the full thing now, or are you still just looking? Okay. All right, I'm going to play this. It's 2 minutes and 6 seconds.
It seems like every one of us has this big library of humanity and nonviolence inside them.
Value.
One thing we have in common as individuals, as human beings, is the power to show love. The basis of nonviolence is love.
Governments have spent billions and billions of dollars getting violent science right in the past 400 years. And I think that it's time that we invest some time and energy into alternatives.
Our evolutionary mandate is to move into the peaceful cooperation, because we see now that we're destroying our own infrastructure. We're destroying the planet we depend on.
If you start from the assumption that everybody has a good core in their nature, that we're all deeply interconnected, that there is no problem which cannot be resolved to the benefit of all parties. If you start with those assumptions, and even if you don't believe them, you take them on as a hypothesis, as assumptions, and you test them, and you find out that it works.
We have to think big. Sojourner Truth didn't think small. Martin Luther King didn't. Gandhi didn't. They had big, bold ideas.
Seeing it firsthand, seeing the power of nonviolence, and feeling we really have the power to make history, to change history.
Great.
Now I've posted the link in the chat.
Great.
Great, thanks, John. Okay, now we're going to open it up to questions. So I don't know who wants to go first, but maybe you've heard something that you want to comment on or ask questions on. If you don't, I'll just hog it again. I don't mean to, but
Yeah, I'll ask, I guess, just briefly. You say ask the right questions. So I guess just regarding the paradox of tolerance, how do you deal with people who, their entire goal is to divide and conquer and that type of thing? I don't know how you treat people like anti-vaxxers who are willfully spreading a disease. I just don't get how you can tolerate them functionally in society.
Well, John, I have a strong answer to that question. And my answer is to realize that is not their only goal. That is what we call a strategy towards a wider goal of getting recognition. A lot of the time, it's getting respect. And what you do as a nonviolence person is precisely see past that facade that they're putting in your face and to appeal to the deeper and more humane person that's in there that they themselves have forgotten about. And one of the things that makes nonviolence work is that we don't want to be those horrible, separate, hateful people that we're presenting to ourselves and to others. You know, I always remember Martin Luther King saying, "I will not let anyone bring me so low as to make me hate him." You know, they themselves are suffering from that. And when you just calmly speak to the other person inside them, you help to bring it up. So there you see the question that Stephanie was just referring to, that, you know, the news story, the concept of human nature, in which it is perfectly possible for a human being to be conditioned to act out violence. But we maintain with Gandhi that no matter how much you do that, you can never, never erase the underlying person who wants to be in harmony with others. It cannot be destroyed. So therefore, you don't give up on anyone. You know, some cases are going to be very hard. You may have to go all the way up the escalation curve. It gets less and less fun as you go.
One of the things that I've noticed recently when John brings up the anti-vaxxer position is not trying to argue with them about it and not getting into a face-to-face discussion, but to take time and think about how to approach it with a person and send an email. Then you're not asking for an immediate reaction to what you say. You're giving that person time to think, just like you had time to think. And it seems to create an opening that sometimes face-to-face would be more difficult. At least that's what
I was in one of these arguments once with my brother-in-law. It was a very heated argument. He's a real MAGA person at this point. But he didn't have the option of throwing me out of the house, because then my sister would not have spoken to him. And so I did what you were saying, Georgia. I just waited very calmly until you reached a point where I think he opened his hand, so to speak, and I could see what was really driving him, which is where he said, "Well, I don't think we're that bad." And I said, "You know, Stanley, I never said we're bad. I only said we have to learn skills to get along with people who disagree with us." And I'll never forget this, because his entire demeanor changed. He just relaxed, like the weight had been lifted off his back. And he said, "Oh, I see." And then we could really have a conversation at that point.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Questions, people, comments?
I mean, I also feel like it's if it's not that which is your trigger, it can be anything else. So being able to get inside and slow down and know that in nonviolence, you're going to run into disagreements all the time. And so you have to be operating on another level and hold yourself to a bit of a different expectation than you would for people who aren't committed to nonviolence. It's a commitment.
Right. Definitely it is. And we can know it intellectually, and actually embodying it then is a 3 steps further, at least.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, I see Ben. Ben, you want to ask a question? I see your hand went up.
Yes, I do. I'm very happy to see Michael. Almost 20 years later, I saw there was a conference in Berkeley at the Poly Ballroom with Michael Lerner, and that was where I first saw you. So it's interesting to see how you've evolved from there. this is like a continuation of an ongoing discussion that we as a group have been having. And it's interesting because we keep trying to approach it. And because of the epistemic lenses through which each of us are dealing with it, we really can't seem to create a consensus on it. So this is, I think, moving us a little further forward. And I think the basic question for me and for you and then for the group as well is I'm curious about why this question of violence is something that is like prominent on our mind. You know, I mean, given the course of human history, concern with violence is a constant, of course. But in terms of our daily lives, as most of us being a professional managerial class at some level of that, we're not experiencing high levels of interpersonal violence in our personal relationship. Our communities are well policed for the most part. The levels of violence are low. And yet there's something about the political atmosphere that which is being fed by the tremendous amount of precarity that everyone has experienced. The people below the bottom 80% are becoming more and more precarious. And so there's a sense in our politics and then in social life now, particularly pandemic, like the social contract is kind of coming unglued. So to me, I think that's what people mean by violence, that is directly related to these material historical circumstances. It's not some free-floating idealistic signifier. I feel like for me, the question is salient because we have a right-wing movement in this country, which has essentially renounced the democratic process and is seeking to undermine it formally to kind of rule through lawfare via permanent minority rule. And that they're also, as a group, heavily armed and well organized at that level. We got a little foretaste of it on January 6th. So to me, I'm just going to put it out. That's my analysis about violence. It's not coming out of the void. So that's my comment and my offering.
Yep.
Let's see, that was really thought-provoking, Ben. With regard to the question that you kind of started off with, which is why are we so more interested in this now when violence has been with us throughout the historical record, assuming for the moment that it has been, which is questionable in some ways. Nonetheless, I believe that along with physical evolution, the human race has undergone and is still undergoing a spiritual evolution. We are evolving spiritual beings, as a friend of mine says. And so that at a certain point in our history, which is now, things that looked and felt acceptable in the past suddenly appear to us in their full ugliness, and they're no longer acceptable. So, and I think Gandhi even says this too. He seems to have said everything I'm interested in saying. But he said, you know, at one point we were cannibals. And then we discovered that I don't like this very much. And so there's a very important, a growth in consciousness, which is really riding upon the evolution. That's why we have Elizabeth Sahtouris and others in the film. I mean, think of how much more conscious we are than, say, this lovely flower on my desk. You know, consciousness has been expanding and expanding, and it's now reached the point where, by and large, we sense the harm and the wrongness of being violent toward one another or toward the planet. So a French philosopher, you can check me on this, Stephanie Jacques Ellul, said, this is not necessarily the time of violence, it's the time of awareness of violence. We become aware that this is very, very wrong. It's counter to our whole evolution.
All right, Ned, you have a question?
Hello, Ned.
Hello, Michael Nagler. I'm one of the lost souls too. I'm very happy to be back in your presence and to meet Stephanie too. Well, this is lovely. Excuse me. I think you just gave light to the answer to my question, which is going further between violence between people, but also between other species and the entire Earth. I'm involved in our climate commission in Petaluma. That's where I'm putting all my energy. So the conversations often skip we bypass the understanding that we're all connected across everything. And we're living in an industrial paradigm which doesn't recognize that the Earth is our storehouse, an abundant storehouse for all the goodies. And who cares about the consequences as we dig them up? Well, we're caring more and more. And I think what you just pointed to about the evolution of our consciousness, well, that mirrors what Thomas Berry said. He felt we'll grow to the point where we will realize that we, as a species, as our consciousness expands to include the entire universe, in his words, that we will then become mutually beneficial to all of life. He called that the ecozoic, because we're finishing off the Cenozoic. So that's been inspiring to me, but I don't know how to act and have conversations that can go that deep, and it may not be possible. But anyway, how does your work in nonviolence, how does it spread? What kind of thoughts can you offer us, Michael, about to the entire, the larger sphere of things, which we're completely dependent upon? Anyway, you know what I'm getting at, but I can't say it well. Thank you.
Welcome, Ned. It's delightful to see you. Yeah, well, this is a question, like your last question is what we have been working on uninterruptedly at Meta, which is, okay, we love this message. We know it embodies a deep truth. We know that it will appeal to people on some level. How then do we get it out there? How do we spread it? And that's where we have this Third Harmony project, which has 3 completely different media, which all embody the same message. It's a film that you saw a glimpse of, and it's a book of the same title, The Third Harmony, and it's the board game that we referenced before. So there should be something for everyone.
And where can you get all these things?
I'm putting them in chat box.
So I'll write it in the chat box as we speak.
Okay, and the whole film is available to be viewed.
Well, yeah, in various forms. You can, for a small amount of money, you can rent it or get access to it for 48 hours, or you can put on a community screening, and then you pay a certain amount depending on how many people in your community. And we're now taking that and designing it specifically for educators.
Right.
And or anyone can buy the package that we're offering, and you get the DVD that way.
Okay, and I think Katie has a question.
Unmute yourself, Katie.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I just heard on the radio on NPR, just as I was entering this Zoom session, that David Brooks said that he thought Trump would probably run this next time. So very important that these discussions continue. My first question is twofold, really. Well, my only question is twofold. This anger reaction, in part, I believe, is rooted in the body. And it's rooted in the amygdala brain, which is fight or flight. I wonder if you can comment on the physical part of this, because I was talking with someone recently about how deep this urge is in the physical body, and finding it even in myself. With 40 years of being a psychotherapist, I can still find, of course, that I'm triggered. And then my other side to that question, it's the same question, but psychologically, and I think you alluded to this, but I can't hear you too well. My audio is not coming out very loud here, but what is this anger rooted in? Because some of the writers are saying shame and fear, and I think you mentioned the ego, but I wondered if you'd allude to that. So both questions have to do with what is the anger rooted in.
Wow. Well, thank you very much, Katie. Yeah. You said something that I think was put too extremely, and that is, from my perspective anyway, that anger is rooted in the body. I don't believe that spiritual realities are physical in origin. They create physical structures. So, for example, you mentioned the amygdala, and we know it's, down there in the limbic system, and it gets activated when we go into fight or flight. But I don't think anyone has proven that the fight or flight response arises from the amygdala, rather that there is, a corresponding physical and spiritual phenomenon. And there's a famous experiment by Wheeler and Fisk, who were both professors, Mary Wheeler and Susan Fisk. They were both professors at Princeton at the time. And they did a simple experiment of, basically they would show you a face on a screen. And if that face was of a person of a different race from yourself, the amygdala would get activated. So, but they did a very clever thing. They said before they flashed the picture, they said, we want you to tell us whether this person likes coffee or tea, or something like that, which may sound very silly, but you see what it did was it bypassed the racial stereotype. And you looked at that person as a human being. You looked into them a little more deeply. And guess what? The amygdala response was largely repressed. Largely didn't happen.
Very interesting.
Anyway, that's where I stand.
Very, very interesting. Linda?
Yeah, a little bit related to that. Rocky and I have just gotten off a book. We haven't finished it yet, but it's a really interesting book, and it seems quite related to what you were talking about early on. The name of it is called Humankind by
Rutger Bregman.
Got it. You like it?
I love it. Yep.
Yeah, I thought you would.
On our shelf outside.
Okay. Well, what really stood out for me in that book, and Katie just kind of alluded to it, is, rather than thinking like critical race theory and all this stuff that the Republicans would have us do or not do, the theory is that is nonviolent at our core. We have this idea that we're tribal and never-ending war is normal, when actually this is not so. Certainly our current, I guess, environment makes it seem we have never-ending war. But if you actually look at history down through the ages, we've had more peace than we've had warfare. And it is not in our nature, as long as we have the chance to clear with people things that are triggering us. So that's the level at which I think, Georgia, you're going to offer your workshop. That's the area that I work at. How do we actually deal with personal conflict so that it doesn't escalate? And I guess that's what you're all about too.
Yes.
Yeah, Linda, it's just, an example of how we've been distorting our history and looking for the negative. And sure enough, when you look for it, you find it. And when you look for it and have found it, then it gets worse. So what we do in nonviolence is we simply promote the positive We approach people with the faith that the positive is in there. And I guess I've always had a funny kind of instinct for this. I was at a protest one time in San Francisco, and somebody was hollering at me from the sidewalk, go home, commies, or that was the bugbear in those days. And I simply looked at him and I said, love is better. Love is better. I don't think I got anywhere, but I think it was the right instinct, because now I would do something like, hey, I'm going to be finished here in half an hour. Do you want to stop and have coffee? And we can talk about this. Yeah, so I think I'm addressing your question, if I understand it well, that yes, we have the potential that we've inherited biologically to be both, to simplify, let's say, violent or nonviolent. Each of them has a purpose. The violent one had much more of a purpose, 100,000 million years ago than it has today. But we have something that animate nature apparently doesn't have, and that is the ability to choose. So that's the critical importance of teaching nonviolence, so people know that they have a choice. And then we have the faith that when people really know this, who's going to choose violence? So we need to, elevate it more and more, which is exactly what we're doing.
And that's where training at a young age is so important.
Yeah.
And if these kinds of programs are learning how to communicate without triggering people, learning how to really communicate so you have a rapport, even if you disagree, is very hard to do if you've had no training whatsoever. And most people have had no training whatsoever. So it's almost impossible to expect people to rise to this level of understanding if they have no background and training in it. So I think it's up to what you're doing, what we're trying to do at Praxis to get this training out there. I don't know how we get it in schools. There's so much, it's so difficult. It's easier to get it in prisons than schools.
Yeah, but there are ways. There's a young fellow named Andrew Bott who took over a school in New England, and he was told, you're crazy. This school is so violent. You're going to ruin your reputation before you even start your career. He went into that school, and you know what he did? The first thing he did was fire the security staff. He said, we don't need you guys. And he took all the money that he saved from that, and he started up the music and art program. And in a short enough period of time, the fighting stopped in that school.
Giving them something constructive to do. I don't know how much longer we want to go on because we've got two people who want to ask questions who have already asked questions. So I just want to see if there's anyone who hasn't asked or made a comment, if they want to do that first. I'm not seeing it.
Only nonviolent comments, please.
Oh, only nonviolent comments. I think Katie was next. So if you can be, I'm going to ask both you and Ben to be very succinct.
Yeah, and you can always send us these questions.
Right.
info@metacenter.org. Meta with 2 T's.
Katie? Unmute, Katie.
Okay, got me?
Yes.
Okay, so we have this reference in this group as well as other places. This is the question you probably get asked a lot. Progressives are too soft. We're too touchy-feely. We're too nice. We're fragmented. How do you respond to people that want to know, that believe this is too soft and sweet and nice idea, but sorry, won't work?
Well, what I would do first off is show them the escalation curve. Say, look, and then start looking at historical examples. When India became independent, there was one state, namely Goa, which was in a colony of the Portuguese. So they weren't involved in the British turnover. And a group of marchers from India walked across the border into Goa. And now brace yourselves, folks. They were machine gunned. and 79 people were killed outright. And you know what happened the next day? They went back in. Only instead of maybe 100 people, I think it was like 700 people. And so, you know, there are many examples of that.
Can I jump in, Michael?
Yeah.
I think there's a real human side to that response of that sounds real good, but I don't want it to work, and look at you people, you're naive. When we peel back the layers on that, we find people who really want to actually believe that it could work, but have been hurt or disappointed or abused in some way. So I think that also the challenge for not just progressives, but anybody who wants to take on a practice of nonviolence is, first of all, to dissociate it from any political affiliation, that I'm not doing this because I'm a progressive, but because I'm human. And then also be aware that we have to show it with our lives. People are watching, and they have a lot of faith in us, even if they're not going to admit it. And they also are paying attention to how they're feeling, how they're being treated. So if they sense hypocrisy, that you say that you promote nonviolence, but wow, you really treat me like garbage. You don't care about me. You want to listen to everybody else, but here I am, somebody suffering in pain in front of you. You don't want to hear my story. We're gonna find out real soon. But as you if you flip it around, you'll find that those people will have a story, that there's a need of healing, and that we can help facilitate that if we're humble.
Could I just add one quick thing to that? Above all, the thing to avoid is first you have to recognize that this is happening and not play on it, not emphasize it. When the minute people hear about nonviolence, they have a deep sense of shame that they haven't lived up to it. So at that point, you have a critical role to play, which is your approach is something like, oh, I perfectly understand where you're coming from and I can see why. And that was not a bad approach, but let me give you a better way. Rather than trying to shame them for who they are, which is going to just drive them deeper into the mechanisms.
I wish there were a better word than nonviolence. A word, a word that doesn't negate violence, but that is another positive, not just positive, but that's outside the paradigm of violence.
Yeah, sharing is a word that I think is the closest. Sharing.
But is sharing? Yes.
Sharing. There's a 1983 feminist science fiction novel by Joan Slonczewski called A Door into Ocean, and the nonviolent society in that are called the sharers, and they even have their own language where they use language that implies that everything that I do is interconnected to how it's being received. And if you really let it sit in, nonviolence is about sharing on every single level.
That's a very good idea. Sorry, Linda, but I do have to go to Ben, and I think we're going to have to close because we're just really getting to the end. And Ben, I'm going to ask you to be very succinct. Okay.
Okay, well, this is one of these questions where, while I've got Michael Nagler here, I might get a response. If you're aware of the work of a cultural writer, theologian named Gil Bailey, who actually lived here in the Valley for 20 years. And he's most famous for his book, Sacred Violence. And I happened to discover at the library at the local St. Leo's Church, where I would go to Mass, that there was a collection of 24 volumes of his lectures. And he started out basically as like a Jungian psychologist, and then became a hardcore conservative Catholic. And so, we kind of parted ways on our politics, but I absorbed that a lot. And the essential teaching he had was that the origin of authority, of violence, is the act of violence, which is sacralized by the consent of the tribe. And that is the beginning, that's the foundation of the state. And so it's kind of a tragic view. He doesn't think violence is ineradicable. I think in fact, they very much believe in the renewal of culture through periodic episodes of sacred violence, or kind of a shearing of the flock, so to speak. So I would like you to comment on that, and I would be very interested in what you have to say about that.
Well, very quickly, because as Georgia says, we do have to wrap up. First of all, I would ask you also have a look at René Girard, his book, The Violence and the Sacred, and a whole number of other books from that. And I think, Gandhi would say, because we have built culture on one foundation, that doesn't mean we can't change it. And there are examples of cultures. In fact, there's one, again, a scientific experiment where they mixed together two different species of monkey, but one of them was very aggressive and the other one was very peaceful, shall we say. And they, held their breath waiting for the aggressive ones to wipe out the peaceful ones. And in a short time, the peaceful ones had re-educated the aggressive ones. So you had these peaceful rhesus monkeys. And you could just as well build cultural institutions on that impulse as we have been building them on the ultimate sanction of violence. And by golly, you find out that they work better.
So I'm going to ask you, Michael, if you have any last things you want to tell everyone while we're recording.
I guess only to say it's been just delightful speaking with all of you. With speaking for Stephanie, we have both enjoyed this tremendously. In fact, we're late for chores that we have to do back at our ashram, so that's how much we've sacrificed
to be with us. Yeah. And you, Stephanie?
Well, it's amazing to think about, and whenever we get into groups like this, to think about solving some of the toughest challenges facing humanity, facing all of life, that you're showing up for these, and to just consider that you're in a room of people that care, and that's our fundamental humanity speaking, and just to keep becoming aware of that everywhere we go.
Right. I want to thank you both so much for taking this extra time to deal with the questions and comments that came from the people on the call.
Thank you for inviting us.
That's
wonderful.
Thanks for setting us up, Georgia.
Yeah, and I want to talk to you soon.
Okay, you bet.
Set something up in person.
Yeah.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. And thank you everyone for being on the call. It was really good input today. And so hope to see some of you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Take care, guys.
And John, I want to ask you something before we leave.
Yeah, what's up?
The volume is so different with different people. How is there any way to get the volume the same or roughly the same with different speakers?
No better way than sitting in Zoom 5 minutes before and doing an audio check.
Well, we can't do it with everybody on the call. We can do it with the speakers.
Right. So the best thing we can do is, have, you and me be the judges, be the two polls, and try to judge that way. Otherwise, yeah, you pretty much have to rely on everyone to.
When I turn them up and when I turn their volume up and down, does that get reflected in the recording?
I don't. Well, first off, we're still recording. That's one.
Oh,
second off,
let me stop that.